You're listening to an episode recorded during the time Innovation Fuel was part of University Canada West. We are proud and grateful for the work we've done together, and we want to thank the university for being in our podcast. We are now excited to continue the journey of Innovation Fuel into its next chapter. Thanks for listening.
You're listening to Innovation Fuel, a business podcast by University Canada West.
Bringing you fantastic stories from accomplished entrepreneurs and key industry professionals. Let's explore the entrepreneurial world through local businesses and our university community.
Good morning, Dave. How are you today?
Doing great, and you, Gelareh? How's the family? How are the skills?
My family are great, thank you. Do you remember we talked with Jack Smith about Indigenous people and their challenges? What is the problem ecosystems for entrepreneur ecosystem? And then he mentioned several things about finding skills, right talents, connecting those talents together. I look at it, there is a lot of incentive for corporates to hire Indigenous people, tax incentives, salary subsidies. But it seems that they're struggling to find right talents, and the talents with the right skills or the talent willing to come to work in big cities.
As we talked with Jack before, one of the challenges in these Indigenous communities is that they want to stay in their Indigenous communities. They want to be supporting their Indigenous communities and supporting their economy. But they also have that gap. And the gap is that, we can get all the tools and the knowledge, but we have this gap of how do we translate that into application? And in order to translate it into application, really the solutions are, how do I get out of the community to go get that application and then come back to the community again? And as you said, there's a limited talent pool. There's some challenges around these things.
That question, is it there actually limited talent pool or access to the talent pool? This is two different things. Maybe there's talent out there, but we don't have access to them.
I think this is something that we need to ask Jack, because I think this is a challenge. Is it a limited talent pool, or is there ample resources and ample talent, but how do we access it?
Absolutely. So let's bring Jack Smith again.
Yes. Welcome, Jack. We're so glad to have you back, my friend. It was such an interesting journey for the last couple of episodes we've had, and we're here for some more wisdom, and I can't wait to chat with you. So Jack, how are you doing today?
I'm really well, and I'm glad to be here again today. I wouldn't refer to what I know as wisdom, but more as what I could tell by way of stories that reflect my experience.
Absolutely, Jack. Absolutely. We finished last episode about the challenges of talents in Indigenous people, especially on the remote places. So I want to know about what is the challenge of Indigenous people in regard of skills, gaining skills, or using their skills?
Right. Well, just to recap a little bit from the last time, we said there are quite a few social things that are kind of in the way of getting to the point before you can even really go about developing the skills or putting people in the right mind frame, or whatever that means, to acquire some of those skills, to be motivated to want to acquire those skills and so on. We talked about things like the workforce or the employment opportunities that are off of Indigenous territory, not wanting to leave home, that sort of thing. Actually, some of the other social ones that we didn't bring up at the last discussion are related to the availability of living accommodation in the community, something as you would think that's fairly simple, or not having good water in the community. So there's all sorts of social things that impede, first of all, your motivation to be at home and develop business and diversify the economy at home. And to make that contribution is a bit of a challenge. And sometimes, too, there's a human component to that, which we haven't discussed, is that I had a student one time, many years ago, I was teaching at the Nicola Valley Institute of Technology, and had a student who was telling me about, I can get all this training here, and I can read all the books I want about business and administration, but do you think I can get a job at home? There's internal conflict, I shouldn't say conflict, but there might be internal issues. about why there might not be available funds, there might not be a home for that person to live in, to stay there, whatever. For whatever reason, that person was telling me they felt more welcome in another First Nations community or Indigenous community where they were able to find work. I think one of the large issues, the other thing is one we raised but didn't really talk a lot about is that there's a thin layer of talent available whenever we have jobs, or whether it's a short-term job that we're able to get funding for, whether it's a business opportunity that an Indigenous community is able to create. Then you start to look for, we want to hire Indigenous people. We want to promote Indigenous people into certain positions that they haven't been having access to. So you find that across Canada and maybe around the world, there's many Indigenous people who have a lot of great ideas, a lot of talent, a lot of contributions to make in business and so on. But they don't have that, and they get snapped up right away. So here's another one of them. Corporations will snap them up. Government will snap them up. First Nations community will say, Jack, come on back to the community. Why don't you do this work for us? Become the economic development officer. And I'll say, okay, that sounds interesting. But when I think about what I'm going to face back there, do I want to live there? Do I want to actually, is everybody going to be supportive of the business initiatives that I might want to bring there? What kind of contribution can I make, and how comfortable am I going to be in that situation? And what's the salary? What's the compensation piece? Because there's a whole HR piece around that. Are there pension benefits? Are there medical benefits beyond what you get? We have a great Medicare system compared to other parts of the world, but and sometimes some businesses or governments offer way better compensation kind of packages than what a First Nation or an Indigenous community or agency might be able to offer. So those kinds of things, and so that talent pool, it's actually fairly thin.
There is a lot of incentive for employers to hire Indigenous people in terms of tax benefit, salary subsidies. And so it makes sense for businesses to hire Indigenous in terms of cost as well. But even in terms of pension, I think that it's I don't know, please let me know if it's the government help anything for pension for Indigenous people if they find a job in a private sector.
Well, current situation, probably Canada, other places, is that there's less opportunity to have a defined kind of pension benefit as part of your compensation package. In many instances, there's getting less and less of that. So in some ways, we're becoming on the same level playing field as many other Canadians at large in the workforce. That's probably not the biggest issue, but it is a big issue. Like Government of Canada, for instance, and I know this intimately because my wife is a employee of the Government of Canada, and so she has a great benefit package, and the pension in there is a defined pension going forward. Will that be an incentive for some people? And I think here we get to the crux of the thing, right? Because there's jobs out there. Corporate Canada picks up the talented people that we have available. Some of them remain on reserve. Lots get snapped up by government, etc. Otherwise, you're looking at, any tax advantage you might have if you leave the reserve. There's kind of competing interests there.
But what, Jack, you said before is the biggest challenge here is to keep these individuals in the communities. And if the incentive is to go outside the community to support the private network elsewhere, then how does that benefit them?
Well, maybe in a couple of ways. Leadership roles, like these people can become mentors, or people like me can go out and work for a while and gain those skills, add to my training and education, come back to the community and work in the community and try to foster more of that happening in the community. But it is a bit of a catch-22, because at the same time as we're saying, that we want people to be in the community, at the same time we're saying, one of the challenges earlier on about economic development generally is if we restrict it to community and on our traditional territory, we often don't have the opportunity now, although that might come in the future. But we have to go out there, get training, most of the schools are out there, et cetera, unless you have something happening internally, right?
How about the remote work, remote education? COVID taught us a lot of things that can do everything remote, basically. But I know that you were talking about the technology in frustration, having access to the technology and internet. It's kind of a problem there, right? It is, if we have this technology and access to internet for everyone, they can find the remote work, they can find the remote education as well. What do you think?
And going back to the same, say, some of the things I learned in business school, right? I think each community, whether it be an urban, say a reserve and or traditional territory community, even an agency that hires Indigenous people, works with Indigenous clientele, whatever, and could possibly benefit, I would like to say should benefit, would benefit from developing strategic plans around their labor needs. First of all, assessing what they have in the community. What are the community's needs? And then look at the people that they have. And if the intention is, which I would suggest it is in the vision or mission statements of most First Nations, they want to provide economic opportunities for all their people. So in the Indigenous community, wherever that might be, a strategic plan that focuses on what the nation's needs are. And if it's a lack of technology, for example, you do a SWOT analysis, right? And if that's a weakness, then, what are the opportunities for remedying that issue, right? And then work on that or set aside that or get somebody to champion that. If you don't have the talent in-house, then you have to find it someplace. You have to find the funding for it. And that in turn raises another set of challenges which are related to, often you can get funding for certain things, but, you have that bureaucratic challenge around how you can allocate those dollars and actually spend them. So sometimes it's not in a very dynamic way or fashion. It's not very flexible. It doesn't match the needs of the community. So part of this whole strategic planning, following from an analysis of the needs of the community, or the needs of the businesses within the community, or what the wishes of the community are in terms of economic and business development long-term, is got to be married to what the individuals in your community. So you have to do an assessment of that as well. What are the community members' talents, what is their current training, education? What are they motivated to do? I think particularly because there's such an attachment to this whole social thing. And if you look at some of the leaders in business in the Indigenous communities today, there is a difference. I mean, people have a different outlook at in the communities about what they would want business to do for them and what would they do if they became a Bill Gates, for example. Where would their money go? A lot of that money would go back into community, I think, more so than just directly into the wealth. So there's different values in that. And so you incorporate that in your whole strategic planning. And then at the end of the day, what do you think that's going to take, given all the challenges we've talked about? Technology challenges, the lack of access to training, or for some of us, it's not a problem to go to school in New York or Paris, right?
I went to Bordeaux for my education. It's possible.
I mean, but for many, it's leaving home and leaving your way of life, your culture for a long time. And I mean, even for yourself, maybe. Eh? But if I go to Paris, it's a different culture. But I happen to have some Franco-Albertan. I was raised partially by that in the system. But these cultural matches are really important, not just for the individual who wants to pursue and develop businesses and how much do they incorporate that in their business. Because they think about their land, they think about their language. We think about our home. We think about our homeland and how much we don't either have access to it or going to mess if we're away. Those sorts of things sort of are part of the thing. So I had a conversation with Mrs. Smith not long ago, and we were talking about businesses and, 700 First Nations communities, a whole bunch of other Indigenous communities, the Inuit and so on, in Canada, and what the community's particular needs are when it comes to providing support and developing the talent within the communities is different. So whatever programs for funding, which is a challenge, right, to get funding to create opportunities. The implementation of the strategy at the end of the day, once you've done, your analysis and then sort of put in, a path forward, moving forward, you can write those in cultural terms. And how does it match? But it has to be flexible. You have to be able to pivot where it's not working. I've run a couple of programs, or a number of programs actually, that made an effort to develop capacity in, say, natural resource officer type work, or even administrative work. And so bringing people along and providing the mentorship necessary to motivate people to see why it's useful for somebody to have the technological skills, say in mapping or even in something, using programs on the computer and how it applies to the work they can do and how it benefits themselves and the community and their work. And that takes a lot of time and effort. So I think any kind of implementation after you've done your analysis and set your program up, and sometimes it takes a long time. And a lot of programs are year to year, right? I mean, funding from government for a lot of programs aren't long-term necessarily. So when the company sets up a strategic plan, it also has to set up the financing. If it's a First Nations Indigenous company, say, for example, at the Brandwings. And another experience I have is with a economic development corporation that has a number of businesses. So it's diversified among, running the usual gas station and convenience store kind of thing, along with attached Tim Hortons. We have an agriculture enterprise, a forestry enterprise, a land management aspect, a couple of other irons in the fire in development, even consideration of, marijuana growth, agriculture type activity. In all of these here, and I'm carefully watching how we develop our community. So about 5 years ago, you'd say that community didn't have that talent pool. But because we have the economy, the diversified economy now, we're taking very detailed steps towards making sure those businesses are actually a success. And so far, so good. And one is a campground, for example, and one is a waterfront development aspect. And so what I'm seeing after 5 years of, or maybe now 4, because we've been in full operation for a little over 3, I think, is that the community is developing. We are developing. The Economic Development Corporation is developing that talent pool. But on the good part of it is that hands-on mentoring, supervisory mentoring. And so that being a successful thing, I've noted that in the past in these other programs, but because they were tied to funding, that was very short-lived. But in this situation, First Nations control government, it's our business. We can develop the people, and we have the financial means, but also the financial plan for that development.
So saying this, and I'm kind of going to come back to this again, because we say we can offer the programs, we can offer the knowledge, but what I'm hearing here is the gap is between the knowledge and the execution. It's great you get the knowledge, but if you don't get the practical execution of the mentorship in how to put that into action, that's where seems to be the divide is.
It's some kind of basic skills that employees need. We have this challenge with international students as well. You can be professional in your own culture, but when you come to Canada, you need to learn the professionalism that works here. What I hear is that it's similar because you keep telling that it's related to their culture, you have to assess them. So you believe there is a professionalism there, but doesn't mean that this professionalism can be matched to what Canadian mindset can be said. I mean, it's the others employers in Canada that they require. Maybe we should assess them to find what the basic relevant skills that they have, for example, such as communication, presentation, because some sort of this, that it can help them to get a job in this market.
I'm thinking of the organizations, at least in BC, of there's employment and training societies, and there's a pretty strong network of that throughout BC. And I think maybe Canada, pretty sure if I remember correctly, most of the funding for those agencies come from Canada. And pick up a lot of the slack where, the universities and colleges really have, different types of professional training, right? So business, law, doctor, et cetera, dentist, and so on. What happens to the tradespeople and the technology people, right? So these education training societies do a lot of work and with Indigenous communities and individuals. I think the gap is clear between, implementation and what there is, right? It's like we talked at one point about taking those studies off the shelf, and then if there's recommendations in there, putting them into effect, and how do you do that? But the other thing is, so that in itself is problematic. But I think in terms of that gap, because I think full circle, we need to address that, and I think that's one of the big challenges. You've done your SWOT, you got funding, you got all that stuff. At the end of the day, who implements it, right?
Exactly. And how implemented, the how, the execution piece that Dave said. Yes, we need to implement this. Traditionally, you have to come to a school or you have to take these online courses to get it. Is it a good way? Or do we need something more about it?
But I also think it needs to be directly reflected back to the community eventually. Somehow we have to create that circle of implementation and saying, okay, well, that's great that you implemented it. Now, how do you drive that back into your community in other implementations that will support the community?
So when I focused on technology in the past, I mean, that's just one of the issues for some communities. Some communities don't have that issue. There is the access there. So that's not necessarily the issue. That I want to go back to that flexibility or the kind of strategic plan you put in place for that. There's got to be an implementation component, right? And it's got to say part of that implementation is getting the resources that you need to put in place to make it happen, right? Who's the tech person who comes to greet me if I have an issue with one of their applications or so on? It's usually a non-Indigenous person. I know we have people, but like I said, they get snapped up by somebody else. So back at the First Nation, we have a lot of people like Jack, who's from a different community, or Dave, who's from outside the community, and Gelareh, and then come in and help, and then, but you can't stay, right? You got careers, you got other things going on and stuff like that. So, it's got to be longer term, and it's got to be a commitment to happen, because like I say, the programs I was able to run in the short term produced some pretty good results, and just, hinted at data or evidence that, if you did this hands-on, you brought in mentoring, you could use technology effectively, but you also need that hands-on personal touch here and there. And you need supervision, you need guidance, you need to do that. And I think that would bring more people along and at least get people, you mentioned the word motivation. One of you did a little while ago. Part of that is assisting people with seeing how what they can do will benefit them and the community, and change some of I want to be sensitive about, there's a reason why some of our communities, at least some of the ones that I've worked in, haven't developed those skills, because they've sort of created a dependency on, governments or the band office or someone to lead the way. And so those, I think the real heroes in business and economic development are the ones that say, no, we should be leading it. I mean, the band office is built for developing it, implementing programs, right? It's an arm of government in a way, and not necessarily our government. But if we want to truly be the boss of that, then we have to start taking control over that, and we can do that by creating these longer terms. And if we develop those strategies, we can include things like workplace integration. We can include long-term mentoring, and this other experience that I have with the Development Corporation more recently, we're seeing a couple of individuals who started out as counter staff, but who are now in supervisory frontline supervisory management within 12 to 18 months, but they had some fairly intensive training, and it's really a success story. The business is doing well. The individuals in the community are doing well, because we did a quick calculation of the dollars that were being paid out in salaries to the community's people. It's upwards of $500,000 that wasn't circulating in the economy previously. So there's the multiplier effect, because we have a business at which they can spend those dollars, or some of those dollars, opposed to taking it outside the community and so on. So it's really good for the business and the individual, but it's also great for the community, because here's one of the differences, I think, where it's not a social enterprise that we've created, but there's a commitment on the behalf of the businesses that when there's a profit, that part of it goes back to the community to supplement other kinds of programs and development, infrastructure development within the community, right, to make up for some of those other shortfalls. So it's a good example of a community that's moving forward. On the other hand, we've had that experience. I've had that experience with other communities who haven't made that kind of progress. Part of it's due to their own commitment to economic development, lack of a strategic plan, not having the available capacity to do it, and the communities, and they're a good example of a community that. People probably watching me might know who that I'm referring to, but that's fine. I don't think I'm saying anything out of line. But I think what we're seeing is that there's a contrast there. Two communities, approximately the same size, approximately with the same type of scenario, that baseline that they come from, and how they've developed or not developed some opportunities that they have, and the individuals along the way. And I think here's another thing that I think is a powerful thing to say is that because I believe that the individual has a lot to say about where they want to go, and that requires a lot of guidance as well, right? And I'm not saying that everybody's going to be a businessman or wants to be a businessman or everybody wants to be a professional, but I think there's more opportunity out there, particularly this day and age when we can actually take our values that are so useful, I think, to Canadian business in terms of stewardship of the land, maintenance of, maintaining who we are in the face of all sort of global pressures to be, full-blown capitalists or whatever, and not think about the social side of things.
These are things that are all solvable. And so I think what we need to do today is I think we need to ask you, Jack, to give us a challenge. Let's throw a challenge out there to maybe help start this direction to help solve some of these challenges. What's your challenge today, Jack?
Well, my challenge today is that, recognizing that the economy generally is a construct. Business is a construct, and probably how we do all of that is a construct. So given what we talked about today, being creative, like open, feel free to think wild and crazy thoughts about what would you include in your strategy for developing the capacity, developing the talent that is there, and create a sort of a deeper pool of capacity to move forward in developing businesses, in developing the overall economy in Indigenous communities. And it's not just restricted to, say, reserved lands or whatever, but it could be across the board, right? I mean, what would your strategy be? And what would your implementation plan be for that strategy? And when do we review it? When do we pivot? Or what kinds of things do we look at before we say, okay, this isn't working? We, include all of that in your strategic plan. I think that would be, I think that'd be a good major paper. And I'd love to see one of those or more of those, because then we could share those with the communities. That would be great.
Excellent. Well, you heard Jack, guys. We need that strategic plan. Let's get working on that.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Dave. That was another episode of Innovation Fuel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Innovation Fuel. We are on all podcast streaming platforms, Google, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts.
Visit our website at www.ucanwest.ca/Innovation Fuel. Also, follow us on Instagram at innovation_fuel.